So again, this is the fourth in a series of 5 workshops. They're all geared around the IT infrastructure library, version 3 of that. We took a Six Sigma approach, and we'll get into all what this stuff means. But really what we did was we invited really everybody from each of the centers to come up, do a yours, mine, and ours process refinement session. Bob and I came in with everything you'd ever want to know about IT change management. And then from there, we tried to lead the group through a series of activities and exercises to come up with, this is the future and potential of what we want to do for NASA going forward. Now, this is to facilitate the development and incorporation of I3P contracts. Basically, you want to make sure that the tos and froms in relation to what the service providers are accountable and responsible for doing versus what NASA is accountable and responsible for doing are all aligned. So we took we understand that there's only so much we can do in the course of a week with 20 individuals, 25 individuals, but we tried to get a strong first cut at what we need to have with regard to change management. If you go on to slide 1, again, the mission, it's a yours, mine, and ours. It's an agency perspective on IT change management. And we're looking at major things like roles, responsibilities, actions coming out of the session, looking at a lot of the initiation of changes via change request forms and authorization. I think these are going to be some of the biggies, right? You've got the ticket associated with change. You've got the authorization. Does it happen at the center level? Does it happen at the agency level? How do we thin those down? Because there's a huge volume of potential change requests. So we'll talk about standard, normal, and emergency change types. And then again, the coordination of change across the environment. On slide 2, major objectives, again, agency-wide, of course, major process tasks and success factors. Looking at the 2B process, now we recognize that there is that there are existing processes. We want to make sure that we're looking at it from an agency process level. We don't anticipate going out to each of the centers and changing procedural documentation with regard to IT changes. Rather, we want to make sure that we have an agency-wide interpretation and roll-up for change management. So, for example, think about it in car terms. We want to say the car needs 4 wheels, a chassis, interior, transmission, engine, all that kind of good stuff. What size engine, what type tires, what kind of brakes are associated with it. That's all, a lot of that is going to be center specific, but ultimately we all drive a car. We're all able to drive on a highway. We're all able to count, how many miles we go, et cetera, the same way. So we'll look at things like roles and responsibilities. We'll look at specific performance measures, associated risks and mitigations in terms of how that relates to the change management process, and then some post-workshop activities. So we know that going out of the workshop, there are things that have to get done, and we've tried to identify those at each of these sessions. On slide 3, on the left-hand side, you see some of the workshop deliverables. These are things we did during the workshop. These are a lot of the outputs. So things like critical success factors, looking at an initial cut. Again, everything is initial cut at categories, types, and items. The 2B process, the RACI chart, or a role responsibility alignment chart, critical performance measures, major inputs and outputs associated with the process, and then some of the risks, as well as, again, an activities plan. Future activities, again, because there's only so much you can do in the course of a week, more detailed process documentation, detailing out of the RACI. Now, a lot of what came out of the Goddard meeting 2 weeks ago will facilitate that. The development of the service offices will facilitate this. Also, risk formalization in we're using the ePort system up here at headquarters. We recognize that there are other systems within the agency. Building out the 2B process in Visio and PowerPoint, looking at the activity plan, building that into a real project initiative, looking at training and outbriefings to the communities. That's going to occur in multiple flavors and formats. This is just one of them. So your center integration leads, your services offices will probably be communicating those initiatives as well. Bob, why don't you take us on slide 4 with CM principles?
Okay. Again, principles is the basic approach, rules to live by as we move forward in this workshop. As you can see, this is a little bit different from the problem management principles, as it should be. You will notice that principle number 4 is this process is aligned with ITIL, in this case V3. Again, we're looking at both standard, normal, and emergency changes. We'll talk more about that as we move forward with the 2B process. The workshop is an initial cut, as Dan said. These are starting points. As we hand these over to the owners in the near and middle future, some of these processes, activities, and tasks may change, and certainly from a roles and responsibility standpoint. Additional SMEs will be asked to review the outputs, and we've been doing that with all of these different workshop outputs and outbriefs. And then, again, appropriate roles and responsibilities is key to these processes, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. What is change management? Remember, a change is an addition, a modification, or removal of anything of an IT service. Any CI, or configuration item in IT, any asset that's being changed or modified or deleted or removed in any way will have to go through the change management process. Change management is the process responsible for the whole life cycle of changes. Now, we do this very well in NASA today. Unfortunately, we don't do a very good job from an agency standpoint. We implemented in pockets certain forms of change management last year when we did the agency-wide planned outage. But normally, it's done either at the mission, at the center, or at the service level. So change management is important, and again, as Dan goes through the details of what the process is, you'll see, well, we do that today. The objective of change management is to ensure that all changes are recorded, evaluated, authorized, prioritized, planned, tested, and implemented. Again, we do a pretty good job of that today, except for maybe the recorded part, but we'll talk a little bit about that when we go over the issues and waste areas. The goal of change management is the process to manage the initiation, review, recording, implementation of all proposed changes. And this is looking at, again, all CIs, for example, software, applications, assets, documentation, and process. Any change from an IT standpoint to any of those is the goal of change management to manage. The purpose of change management is to ensure that we have standardized methods, efficient and prompt handling of changes. All changes are recorded, we keep saying that, and the overall business risk is optimized when we do a change. We're going to talk more about what does that mean.
Now, on slide 7, you heard Bob mention standard, normal, and emergency changes. And you heard him say we do a lot of change management today, and I think everybody does. One of the issues, though, is if we're talking about any alteration to the configuration of the environment, that's a lot of stuff. Historically, I've been to some of the financial services providers, and they would say, yeah, we do 210 changes a day. A lot of applications groups will say, yeah, we do 40 changes a month. If you're if you're working for missions and there's a mission going on, you may say, we're not doing any changes for the next couple of weeks. So what we want to do is we want to look at all the changes or potential changes that we have within the environment and affix the right level of authorization associated with them. So what we typically do is when you look at some of the very simple changes we've seen, quite a bit, known impacts, known workarounds or known backouts, relatively low risk, low cost. A lot of these things can be pre-authorized, so the change advisory boards would say, you know what, we see these all the time, you're good to go. Just document what you did, and you can make that, make it happen. I'll thread some examples from the next page with this, but you'll see things like a desktop refresh or catalog pre-approved items, for example, single user moves. A lot of those don't have to go through, the full-on change process every time. So that way we're thinning the herd, right? We're taking 60 to 70% of changes that are typically bureaucratic in nature, and just saying go ahead and do them as long as you document them. Then we have certain changes which really do merit some oversight. You could look at things like an operating system update or a major planned outage, and say that really should go through the service provider executives, the service executives. That should go through an agency level, not just the center level authorization boards. And what we want to make sure that when we have these happen is that we follow a normal change path, so that we have a change recorded, it's evaluated, authorized, prioritized, planned, tested, implemented, documented, and reviewed. So there's a significant amount of work that's going to go on there. But again, these are changes that are normal, but they don't happen every day, so we want to make sure they're documented. And then we'll have an avenue for emergency changes. These are things, the oh no's, we got to get these things done within the next 24 hours. And these are really intended to repair an error in an IT service that's negatively impacting the service levels. So it's not everything becoming an emergency. There's something that's specifically impacting a service level, and we need to restore service. So some things like critical patches, for example, security patches during or close to a mission, or WAN placement, for example. These are things that can all occur. You'll see these on slide 8, where we took an initial cut at prioritizing or categorizing certain change types. So you'll see again the standard, normal, and emergency. You'll see different examples here. And Bob Johnson and Dan Vogel came in, and we had our list of stuff, and we said, okay, this is how we would categorize them. And we had folks like Tom Florio and Steve Young going, no, that's not how we would categorize them. So the group got together, as we would expect, and we tried to prioritize and categorize them in this fashion. So you'll see things like an email change, for example, being a normal change, or an application upgrade being a normal change. And they have certain authorization points associated with them, as I described before. So standard changes. It's gone through the normal change process at least once, and that community has said, we pre-approve this kind of a change. Normal change, there's a technical approval required. There's commonly budgetary approval required. And then an emergency change type of a format, that's typically a subset of the change boards, where people will agree that given the time constraint, given the impact, given the potential risk to the environment, it has to be executed within a certain amount of time. We're comfortable with this set of folks authorizing that particular change type. So really, it's not minimizing what gets a change ticket associated with it. It is minimizing the levels and people that have to be associated with that change. This way, it's not just, oh, so-and-so's a smart guy, they know everything about the environment. Because, no, not everybody does know everything about the environment. This is what's the right community to get together at what level. Bob's going to take us through on slide 9 now with the as-is process assessment.
Okay, a lot of this is repetitive, so we apologize, but there are a lot of people who are just joining this for the first time. So we're going to go through what this means, what this particular slide means. And that is a real critical path in the workshop where we describe the current state as best we could at a certain level. Everybody from the missions and centers and other service areas came up and tried to identify from the basic task level, and we'll go through those, what was being done right today, what was being done okay, and what was certainly a waste area. You can see the different stickers that voted on that. A lot of good things are being done well. I think a lot of the red you'll see when we talk about the issues is back to the agency-wide. A lot of this is being done very well at the center level, at the mission level, or even in pockets within different services. So again, this is a very critical task for everybody to come up and identify how we're doing this today. We identified out of X amount of waste areas and issues. In this case, I think it's the top 5. I'll read these off to you because they are real critical, because we did address these specifically from a cause and effect and a mitigation standpoint. The first one is multiple systems exist today, but little or no integration, as we've been saying. Approval policies and procedures in place today, but they're not standard across agency-wide. Sometimes it's ad hoc. Sometimes it's done very formally. And I won't name the different service areas. Some service areas are very mature, and some get it done, but they don't do it in a maybe formal, documented fashion. A lot of times there's unofficial approvers. It's kind of like everybody knows it's okay to make that change, to change that blade out. We do it all the time. Just go ahead and do it. An RFC, or a request for change, number 5, may not be routed to the proper groups for assessment, which leads to an inconsistent review of the change. So without the proper procedures in place that would follow a request for change, without the proper escalation from a functional and hierarchical sense, certainly certain groups could be missed from a communication sense, and that's not a good thing, especially if you have to repeat this. Vendors and contractors can make approvals with little NASA insight. Sometimes this is the effect of the contract that we have with them, but we're going to do our best to give them a lot of insight. We'll show you what that means to any kind of change that affects anything from an agency standpoint and certainly from a service standpoint in an outsourced sense. Inconsistent communications. Need I say more? This could be on every one of these. Again, it's not formalized across the agency. And it's real key that we know what changes took place. Dan said it a little bit earlier, if you were part of that most incidents in anybody's service management area is caused by self-inflicted wounds. Most incidents are caused by changes. So it's real key that if a change took place at 3 in the morning, we all show up at 8 in the morning, and everybody's got 1,000 tickets. We know exactly what took place. So we took these issues. I'm sorry, there's one more. There was 6 issues. Change stakeholder integration is not clearly understood. So who owns this change? Who are the cabs? Who are the change control boards? We'll address those in a minute. So we did address these as a team, those top 6, and we used some Six Sigma tools that are in our tool bag, the cause and effect analysis and the source of variation matrix. Cause and effect, you may notice the Ishikawa or the fishbone, where in great detail we break down that waste area and try to find out why is this happening from a technology, people, tool, and process standpoint. Source of variation matrix, we take those whys and causes and effects and come up with mitigation. Come up with how can we prevent this? Again, all in the momentum of building our new 2B process.
Thanks very much, Bob. So on slide 14, we looked at all these issues. We looked at, the whys and hows and what do we do about them. And we had a brainstorming session. So we said, okay, guys, what do you think we should do? How do you think we can resolve all of these issues that we've been discussing? So the group on a series of Post-it notes started to jot down their ideas. And what you see is some of the sausage of, or some of the makings of the sausage on the right-hand side of this chart here. Now, we looked at the ease of the significance of the benefit as well as the ease of the implementation or complexity of the implementation. And what we decided was, okay, if it's a small benefit versus a big benefit, or if it's easy or hard to do, how do these ideas or how do these things we think could resolve some of the issues, where should they fit? So if it's easy to do but has a relatively small benefit, that gets labeled with a P, so it's possible. If there's a big benefit and easy to do, well, we're just going to implement that, so that gets an I. If it's big benefit, but it's still, somewhat difficult to do, that's going to be a challenge. And then things that are, small benefit and hard, we're not going to even address those. We're just going to kill those. Thankfully, we don't have too many kills. A lot of the thought, given it's only a week-long session, was really focused on the implement and potential challenges. A lot of the Post-it notes, which you can't see here, are sometimes 10 to 15 deep, and we try and prioritize and pull those in that way. But that's what Bob referred to as a pick chart. Now, on slide 15, what we did was we took some of those ideas, we took some of the stuff coming out of the issues, just some general experience, some of what we came in with, and again, you're seeing a little bit of the sausage being made here, but we tried to identify the major tasks. So there's a request, ticket, categorization, prioritization, scheduling, plan, build, test, and review, all going across the top-hand part of that graphic. Down the left-hand side, you have the common roles and different communities that are accountable for performing these, and we tried to jot down or put up here's what happens at such and such a point in time. Now you'll see at this point, we don't have any lines drawing to any points here. We walk through it, it's penciled up, but even up to the, probably the last part of the third day, we were still trying to, we were still coming back and readdressing how does this really get implemented? Because everybody's got their own perspective on how change management works or any of these processes work. And what we try and do is, as we're learning and we're getting more familiarity with everybody else's interpretations, we'll move things around. What we did come up to agreement on slide 16, though, is that there's, there are a set of activities. I think here we've got about 7. Create and record the request for a change. Review that request. Make sure all the information is complete. Look at that, evaluate that change. Make sure that, who does it go to? Authorize it. Plan and schedule it. Coordinate the implementation. Review and close that change record. So those are some of the core high-level things, and everything sounds pretty easy and pretty pleasant to do. On slides 17 through 19, this is a lot of the output of what we were coming up with and what we've been discussing. So again, across the top, you'll see some of the major blocks: create the request, review the request, on and on. Down the left-hand side, you'll see the requester, which could be, Bob Johnson, Dan Vogel, Mike Metzger. Could be some of the tier 2, 3 technical service contract support. It could be even a customer. Then we've also got folks that perform a change management role, people that really guide the ticket through the process. When we say a role, it's a hat. It's not necessarily an individual, although in a lot of cases it could, there is a lot of work. It could be an individual. And then we've got a grouping there for tier 2, 3 service providers. Those are typically going to be the contract support folks for, in this case, I3P. And then we'll have a lot of handoffs and feeds to and from external processes, things like incident, problem, service request, continual service improvement. So what you see here is the greens are typically the starting points of where change requests are going to come from. So a requester in this case could be just about anybody. And they're going to log an RFC. Typically, because they're more technology focused, it's probably going to be them entering the ticket as opposed to something like incident and problem where the service desk might execute that ticket or fire off that ticket. Someone in a change management capacity has to say that change ticket is complete. That change ticket comes with a backout procedure. That change ticket has risk associated with it. All this good stuff has to be accounted for, and somebody somewhere has to say that's a complete ticket. Otherwise, they've got to kind of push it back and say, come back to us when you have all that information in play. We mentioned standard, emergency, and normal changes. Well, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff here and make sure that we're addressing things with the least amount of bureaucracy as possible. So if it's a standard change, a pre-approved change, what we want to do is make sure that that just goes right over. You're not even seeing it on this page. It's going to go to the next slide where it'll get addressed through an emergency change team. You've got, or actually through the service provider, excuse me. The emergency change, say it's not a standard change, but it's an emergency change. Okay, well, that's going to go over to the emergency change team, and they're going to address it. If it's a normal change, a change that requires all the appropriate assessment, all the appropriate authorization associated with it, both at a center level and or the agency level, well, then it's got to go through the normal change process. So up until this point, all we're doing is we're creating a request and we're reviewing that request for categorization and completeness. If you move on to the next slide, which is slide 2, in the slide presentation, it's slide 18, but from the flow slide, it's slide 2. You'll see the 1s, the 2s, and the 3s coming from the previous slide all being addressed here. So if it's a normal change, okay, it comes in and it gets addressed in the basically by the Center Change Advisory Board. If it has to roll up to the Enterprise Change Advisory Board, it does so. And again, there's advisory and there's also authorization. So you'll have both those levels of support at an agency level, certainly, and at a central level, and potentially at an agency level. There is a lot of documentation associated with both the change advisory boards, the change control boards, the enterprise change advisory boards, and the enterprise change control board. So we have that in separate presentations and documented. So if you're interested in that, we can get that to you. If it's an emergency change, well, then it goes through and it's got a distilled subset of those change authorization communities that we described before. And if they say, yep, you're good to go, then it gets authorized, it gets communicated with the technical teams. Basically the requester is going to be the one that's driving that, and then it goes down to the Tier 2, 3 community, basically the service providers in support of the I3P contract, and they're going to start addressing it. If it had been pre-approved, likewise, this is where it's going to get addressed. And oddly, you'll see a red box or a red dotted box in the lower right-hand corner here. There has to be a coordination effort required. Okay, not all changes are done by one service provider. So if there is coordination across multiple groups, that has to be addressed somehow. We put it here. That could be an agency, a center agency representative, basically a NASA person, or it could be a designated individual, but ultimately there has to be a coordination effort required. They'll determine whether or not there is additional coordination required. If not, the service provider, which is in the black box, and we lovingly put it in the black box because these are things we know they have to do. We can't dictate how they do it, but we know that it's going to occur, so we black boxed it. They're going to get the change ticket. They're going to say, yep, I'm good. All the information is there, in which case they'll fulfill that request. Or they're going to say, I need more information, and then they're going to route it up. So there's an opportunity for hierarchical escalation, in which case they're going to go through management to get support. And there's a functional escalation, in which case they could go through other service providers to make that happen. There's a lot of detail underneath the hood of this engine, and but ultimately you get kind of the basics associated with this flow. So up until this point, we've identified, on the last slide it was a ticket gets generated and is there enough information there. On this slide it was more of the authorization and then also the service provider actually making that change. On the next slide, which is slide 19, this is really where we get to more of the closure. Now, I think we recognize that you could have a service provider perform a change. And they're going to say, yep, I'm good to go. We're done. That doesn't necessarily mean that the change is complete. So we need to have somebody, and what we did was we identified the change requester, because they're going to be the ones most familiar with the process, being the ones to say, yeah, that change was performed and it was fulfilled the way we expected it to. If not, it could go back to that requester or that, it could go back to that Tier 2, 3 service provider for additional work. Or if it has been fulfilled, as was stated, then they put it for pending for closure. They make sure that if there's any information for the communication plan, that it gets documented. There is a post-implementation review that goes on, and then they close that change ticket. If they're not satisfied with it, again, it goes back to the Tier 2, 3 service support for fulfillment. If they are satisfied that the ticket should be closed, then there are status updates that occur. So the service provider should know, yep, we agree with you, it was closed. Also, any kind of updates to the configuration management databases or configuration management system has to occur. So I made a change. Where does that get documented? So is there a mapping of all NASA stuff and how it fits together? Was the change documented there? And then ultimately, we're going to go back through other processes like continual service improvement to ensure that, one, it's a good process, two, we're adhering to the process, and three, if there are opportunities for improvement, for example, more delineation with regard to standard, normal, and emergency changes, that we address those at that time. So what I'd like to do is let me open it up to questions, because I know that's a lot of process flow in a short amount of time. Do we have any questions so far? Excellent. So Bob, why don't you take us through on slide 22, critical success factors?
Okay. Just as every other process, it's critical that you identify the areas that are key to the success of that process. In other words, if these aren't done, the process that we just defined, developed, if you will, is going to fail. Communication audience should be clearly defined and targeted. Dan was talking about a lot of workflow there from both a functional and a hierarchical standpoint. In other words, if you think of a particular use case like planned outage, which we do very well, we do it a couple times a week, I would say. Again, they know who their audiences are. They know where the workflow should go for that particular audience. We got to make sure that happens every time. Clear and concise representation of the process from a training, from a service provider standpoint, from any kind of person that was touched in the process that Dan went through. We got to make sure that as we migrate to this agency-wide approach, people know how to use it. One example, and Dan said it, is the RFC. There's going to be one RFC that's going to be pulled up in a new machine, the service desk. It's going to take a little bit of education, and it's typically a pretty educated person that's going to fill out that request for change. Performance measures that are meaningful, ensure that the process integration, this is key for all the processes, that as we work with the different vendors as they come on board, they communicate and work with us from an integration standpoint. And again, we do a pretty good job of that today. Again, if you think of the use case planned outage, a lot of preamble, a lot of pre-meetings before that RFC even gets put into the system. CSI is really important to success of these projects and processes, as Dan said. Process roles be clearly defined, accurate and timely updates to the CMD, the Configuration Management Database. Again, all the activities that took place from a change standpoint, all of the CI changes that took place, all the relationships have to be built and notated in the CM, or there could be a lot of trouble. All events must have a ticket. A lot of changes are taking place today ad hoc because it's the way we've always done it. We can't do that anymore from an agency-wide perspective. Then clear scope definition. The risk, again, as we said for the other one here, we're going to keep these confidential. We just want to point out that risks were identified in the workshop. They are being worked. They're real critical to the success of this program, of this process, and all of the I3 programs. And just well know that these are being worked and owned and are very important. From a RACI standpoint, as we said, a critical success factor is the role for change management. Dan went over a lot of these roles. You can see some of them on the left-hand side. The Change Advisory Board, the Enterprise Change Advisory Board, the Change Control Board, etc. Again, in a lot of service areas, these are taking place today. They're documented very well, doing a great job. Again, when we do our planned outages, we're changing a blade on a critical Cisco router at 3 in the morning. That affects both data center, that affects network, that affects email. We do a real good job of communicating and going through this approval process with those particular management areas. Across the top, as all RACIs, sometimes you'll see it reversed on the left-hand side, but in this case it's on top, are the critical task areas that Dan went through and pointed out in the 2B process that we all defined.
I haven't spent any.
Again, accountable means, A means accountable. In this case, the change manager role or manager would be accountable for all of those tasks. I'm looking at them. Yes, they're responsible for all of them. I'm sorry, accountable for all of them. R means responsible. C means consulted. I means informed. So, as Dan said, as we move forward, we expect this to change. As NASA more clearly defines the roles and responsibilities for some of these new roles coming on board, we know that this RACI chart could change. But this is our first cut, our first start at this, and this is been handed over to folks for approval.
You know, a lot of the roles and responsibilities are dependent on what the organization decides to do with the service offices. So certainly that's a big, what if. And I think some of that was identified out at Goddard a couple of weeks back. But, this information here still stays true because, this is typically what happens in the rest of the free world outside NASA. And most of this is what's happening right now within the centers. So we're not saying that it's got to be this person or it should be done by this group only, rather that the role is accounted for and it's adhered to within there.
That's a good point. I'm staring at this, and I know we do most of this today in these fashions, the activities across the top and the cabs and CCBs that you see on the left side.
Now on slides 23 and 24, which you have coming up next, these are the recommended key performance indicators. And, a couple things to really consider here is, there's a level of maturity that we can get certain performance indicators at right now. Things like number of changes. We should be able to get that right now. Number of changes by type. Well, we're currently looking at categorization of types and items and such, and, standard, normal, and emergency. So there's certain things we can do right now, but in the future, we'll be able to capture much more information, I should say, in relation to other information there. So right now, looking at things like number of changes submitted, number of changes submitted in relation to a particular configuration area or service area, all that kind of stuff is going to roll up. So even though we might have certain pockets of it at the center levels today, we don't have it at the agency level. And just like we discussed before about a car, the process versus how you tune the car or the procedures at your centers, we're looking for it at the agency level. And I think ultimately everybody agreed that these are performance measures that we can really, get at and we can really agree with. So you're going to see things when we look at percentage or number of emergency changes by type. Well, that's a pretty telling indicator of, how much chop we have to do on a regular basis. If we look at aging reports by type, the time it takes to approve the request for a change, that's a pretty telling indicator. So, I think initially what we should expect is a very basic set of change management measures, things we can get our feet wet with, things we can start experimenting with roll-up and communication, but then going forward as we start to mature, looking at, hey, here's an area where we don't have to get change authorization every time for this type of a change. This should be a standard change. Or, hey, we keep having a problem with this particular service provider in relation to this change type. It might be worth having a discussion with that vendor to make sure that they document or have backup procedures associated with that change. So there's a lot of information we can leverage and use with regard to these change performance indicators.
The output from the workshop, again, we can't get everything done in 1 week, even though there's 22 people, 100% dedicated heads down. We came out with specific activities related to the workshop process development. In this case, I'll go through these. These are being worked. Many of these are being worked this week. Looking at use case development, key with change management, we thought that good use cases would help everybody from a training standpoint, from a service desk standpoint, how to put this change in. Pam's the owner of that, Pam Medford, if you know her. The RFC data baseline, we've been working on that. That should be finished, actually, we think this Friday, where basically when you do pull up the RFC in Remedy, is the impact there, is the risk there, are the names there, are the actions there, are the approvers there, is everything there we need to move forward in that process we just showed you. We're real close on this. Change management role description key. We're actually going to be working on that this Friday, and that Moore is the owner. And again, at a very certain high level, what are the key roles and responsibilities for that role? And then documentation's been complete, as you saw the process.
Now, what you see on slide 26, we always like taking pictures of groups of people that participated. It's always nice to go back and, just remember who was there and different kinds of things they provided at the workshop. But what you see across all of our sessions are a lot of the same faces. And we were very lucky to have that. I think some of it has to do with the level of participation in the first workshop, and then people just wanted to be involved going forward. So we had the right people. We had lots of participation head down for that week, each week, every week. And we did see a maturation of the workshops where initially it was, I don't know what Six Sigma is. I don't really know what ITIL is. What are we doing here? How are we going to do this? And then the second time, it was, okay, I know what the tools are. I know what the outputs are going to be. Let's just head down, do it. By the third workshop, it was, well, wait a minute. We said this in the first and second workshops. Are we staying true to that? Are we threading these processes together? So it went from a very basic process understanding to pretty strong process understanding to threaded process understanding, and that's something that we were very happy to see. It doesn't happen that quickly very often, so we were very excited about that.
Just really, really lucky. Very, very talented people dedicating a week of their time. So much appreciated.
Absolutely. And for all the management that supported that, very excited to have that. Again, there's a big project. Bob mentioned the project activities on the last slide. Those go probably 200 lines deep. A lot of groups participating there, a lot of sub-activities associated with it. And ultimately what we want to do is there's a lot of information. We need to get it in the hands of both the center integration leads and the service offices. That's true for the centers that are hosting as well as the centers that aren't hosting hosting these contracts. So what we're trying to do is we're recording these sessions. We'll make them available to the center integration leads. But if you have a technical group or another group within your center that would like some specificity or some targeting with regard to what we're talking about and putting it into relation to what they do on a day-to-day, Bob Johnson and Dan Vogel are very happy to have a special session with that group. You just let us know, tell us where and when, and we'll be there. But we will make this recording, we will post it for anybody that's interested. Can we open it up to questions? Anybody have any questions out there? Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending. If you have questions you're just a little shy to ask, feel free to give us a shout, send us emails, call us, and we'll be sure to address it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.